Hello, everyone, and welcome to our Applying Ethology webinars. I am Laura Whalen, a PhD student at the University of British Columbia. Before we start, I would like to remind everyone to mute their microphones and please turn off your video. If you have questions at any point throughout the presentation, please type them in the chat box and I will ask them at the conclusion of the presentation. Today, we are very pleased and lucky to have Sarah Byosiere sharing her work on shelter dogs in New York City. Sarah is the director of Thinking Dog Center at the City University of New York at Hunter College, where she studies the behavior and cognition of dogs. Welcome, Sarah. I'm very much looking forward to your presentation.
Hello, thank you for having me. Hopefully you can see a screen.
Yep.
Awesome, and hopefully there are maybe some subtitles or closed captionings happening at the bottom. The captions don't always get it right, so we'll see how well they do, but in general, hopefully they're helpful and not distracting. So thank you to the Applying Ethology program and series and the Slack channel for animal welfare for letting me come and join you guys virtually today. I think that's an amazing resource that they have, and it's been a pleasure to get to see all the materials that have been posted, review all the webinars, and it's such an amazing lineup of content that we should surely take advantage of. As Laura said, my name is Sarah Byosiere, and I'm the director of the Thinking Dog Center at Hunter College in New York City. And we conduct research on dog cognition and behavior, oftentimes at our on-site space, which is my virtual background. Sadly, I'm not there right now, but usually it looks something like this. And we also conduct research outside of our space in collaboration recently with various New York City animal shelters. And that's the research that I want to talk about and highlight today. So before I even begin, I need to thank these three amazing colleagues of mine, Jen Abrams, Nicole Passmore, and Christina Wilson. The work that I'm going to be talking about today would not be possible without the work of these three remarkable women. And so it's really important that I start off by highlighting them at the start, and I'll also highlight them at the end, and you'll see their pictures throughout. They have been amazing to work with, and they are go-getters in this field, and I've been so fortunate to get the opportunity to collaborate with them. So thank you guys if you're here, and if you're not and you're watching this later, I hope I've selected cute photos of you. All right, let's jump right in. Okay, so we're talking today about dogs, we're talking about shelters, and when you think of a typical animal shelter, a few things may come to mind. In general, I often feel like shelters are associated with both positive and negative aspects. So in the sense that you may experience, a negative connotation of a shelter because there's a surrendered or possibly seized companion animal that's spending some time in this place. However, at the same point in time, it's also a positive kind of experience in the sense that these companion animals are going on to find a better home, hopefully. And so oftentimes you may have both these mixed feelings about a shelter. From the animal's perspective, though, specifically the dog, that's what I'm going to be talking about today, a transition into the shelter can be a total surprise. You may not necessarily know that that day is the day that you are going to the shelter. It's when you get there, there's strange noises, there's strange smells. You've been separated from an attachment figure. Likely your entire routine has been disrupted and will continue to be disrupted. And this might mean that you're going to see possible increased stress levels, which may be because of social isolation, spatial restriction, a combination of all of these things already. And so that just ends up resulting in increased cortisol levels and oftentimes undesirable behavior changes. So it's important to note that even for the most well-adjusted companion animals, the shelter is a real jarring change to normal life. So how do we stay positive? How do we combat this? Well, shelters and organizations have tried everything in their power and are continuing to try everything in their power to make this as helpful of a place as possible. So while the shelter can be exceptionally stressful, there are different ways to mitigate this kind of stress. So for the talk today, I want to consider these methods here, and I want to consider them as tools. I'll talk about more specifically the tools that we've been investigating, but I want us to think about them as different tools that all together make up a large animal sheltering toolbox in a sense. So depending on the specific job that you need to accomplish, it might mean that you need a specific tool or combination of tools. Some of the tools that are currently used are things like in-kennel enrichment. And so this could be the use of toys or food puzzles, scent enrichment. There's a really new paper, I think it came out last week, on using different types of scents. You can use music. There's a whole bunch of different things. You could also think about providing breaks for the animals that are in the shelter. So if the shelter is an exceptionally stressful environment, it might mean that it's hardly ever quiet. And that might mean that you don't really get the best night's sleep if your kennel mate next to you is not having a great time. And so providing breaks, sleepovers, or utilizing foster programs can give those dogs a break from the constant activity that's continually buzzing around them. Other things that we can do are providing human contact. So within the shelter itself, providing them pets and cuddles if they want. These types of things can be helpful. And also looking at maybe that it's not the presence of a person, but it is actually this contact. So in this bullet here, environmental change, it's referring to the idea that sometimes when you have changes in the environment, so by removing the people and the traffic that are constantly coming into the shelter, you actually see that you observe fewer stress behaviors. So it's not just that the presence of people is important, it's actually the contact with the people that's important. Actually just having a lot of incoming activity can be rather stressful. And then there's play groups. So for dogs that enjoy hanging out with other dogs and getting the chance to interact with other companions, this can be a really helpful activity. And so these are just some of the tools. There are many, many more, and I've only listed a couple of them here, but it's just to give you an idea of how you can imagine that these things work together with one another, and that there's no one size fits all tool for solving all of the problems that are out there. So in terms of staying positive and what I'm going to be talking about today, in addition to the tools that I just talked about, I want to talk about the tools that we've been evaluating. And these are specifically related to how can we reduce contagious illness in the shelter? How can we evaluate the effect of breed stereotypes and continue the research that's actually already been done on this topic? And how can we minimize in-kennel stress? So to begin, we're going to start with talking about topic number one, which is reducing contagious illness. So this project is a project that took place not too long ago, actually, and we kind of started in 2018, but we've been working on it for about a year now. And it took place at animal care centers in New York, and Jen Abrams has been instrumental in this project. She did a phenomenal job working on this with Dr. Brennan, the veterinarian at ACC. And it's important to note that ACC is New York City's only open admission animal shelter, and it has multiple locations across the boroughs. The research that I'll talk about today took place at 2 of those locations, but in particular, because of the fact that they are New York City's only open admission animal shelter, they see massive intake numbers, and they've drastically improved many of their statistics in the last 10 and 15 years. And all of these improved statistics have stemmed generally from changes to adoption policies, different types of kennels, changes to feeding schedules, lights out programs, the removal of breed labels, which is actually something I'm going to talk about next, but in a different shelter, as well as different staffing changes, enrichment program expansion. So they've done almost everything that they can in order to sort of make the shelter as positive of an environment as possible. However, regardless of all these improvements that they've sort of implemented, the shelter in New York City particularly has still observed really high rates of kennel cough. So in 2018, they began piloting the use of a low-dose trazodone administration, sort of as a pharmacological intervention, to see whether or not this could be used to help evaluate whether the illness rates were being driven by immune suppression, particularly related to the transitional stress that was experienced when coming into the shelter. So just a couple things to note about trazodone. It's an atypical antidepressant. It's a serotonin receptor antagonist and reuptake inhibitor, and it's often indicated to treat anxiety and stress in cats and dogs. Sometimes you might see that this is prescribed for fireworks and things like that. So it's something that can be taken just before a stressful experience, like maybe a car ride as well. So what Jen did was she looked at the data that the shelter had regarding the pilot year, so the year that dogs were given trazodone at both the Brooklyn and Manhattan Animal Care Centers, and that was in November and December 2018. And during those months, dogs that came into the shelter were given 2 doses, 5 milligrams per kilogram, given during this transition period into the shelter, so their first 48 hours into the shelter space. And we compared things like length of stay and the number of sick dogs to 2 previous years. So in a sense, historical controls, both from the same months, November and December, from 2016 and 2017. So here's just a breakdown of the data cleaning process and how many cases went into each sort of little bucket for categorizing these years. So what we found was we didn't see a difference between certain rates in November 2016 and 2017. So we combined those 2 together as sort of our historical control. And we looked at different things. The first thing that we looked at was, is there a difference in the average number of sick dogs that have kennel cough when we compare the no trazodone and the trazodone groups? And what we see is that there's actually fewer sick dogs in the trazodone group. So that's what's being depicted here in yellow. The average illness number of sick dogs, or percent of sick dogs, I'm sorry, was 41.2% across the 2016-2017 years, and that was 29% in 2018. So it does seem like possibly there could be some sort of relationship here. This relationship was significant. Then we asked another question. So do dogs given trazodone spend less time in the shelter? So is their length of stay shorter? And what we found was that it was significantly shorter for dogs in the trazodone group. I know that these numbers don't look that large, so we're looking at a difference of 1 day, essentially, between the trazodone and the no trazodone group. But in this shelter, 1 day does make quite a bit of a difference, and given the large sample size here, this is significant. So it does suggest that dogs in the trazodone group were spending less time in the shelter. And what we were also interested in looking at was, are the dogs that are given trazodone more likely to get adopted? Or are there differences in sort of the outcome of the distribution of where these dogs go compared to the trazodone group and the no trazodone group? And what we found was that there were significantly higher adoption rates in the trazodone group. That's being depicted here in the bar graph that's on the right. What you see is that the average adoption rate when trazodone was implemented was 42.1%, whereas when we were looking at the years where no trazodone was given, rates were about 30.4%. What's interesting is that there's no difference also between any of the other outcome groups, and euthanasia rates remain the same. They're fairly low to begin with, but it is interesting that the only outcome group that changed was the adoption group. So when thinking about this, there are possible new practical use implications for using trazodone as a pharmacological intervention. What we see is that it might be that there's decreased stress levels, and that could help improve resistance to things like kennel cough. It could be that the decreased stress levels then also improve behavior or kennel presence, maybe engagement with possible adopters. So maybe this results in a reduced length of stay. And this might mean that then there's more frequent and faster adoptions. But it's also really important to recognize the limitations and the cautions associated with this particular project. So this is all correlational. This is not causal. We're just looking here essentially at the historical records. And so that means that this is not a clinical trial. This is not something where we have an experimental group. So one of the things that we could do in the future, and which we strongly urge people to look into, is look whether or not there's an experimental paradigm with a control group, or maybe looking at an alternative pharmacological option to evaluate. The other thing that we don't necessarily know is whether or not the drug may be masking behavior or just decreasing anxiety like we expect. We wouldn't want it to be masking behavior. That doesn't seem like it's a good thing for the dogs. And so here, what we could do is look at a behavioral study, potentially seeing at whether or not the behavior of dogs in these two groups is substantially different. It's also really important to note that this is not a Band-Aid. This is not something that you do when you haven't tried anything. This is an option when you've exhausted all of the measures possible. So at ACC in particular, they had done everything that they possibly could, and this was used as a last resort to evaluate whether or not future policies needed to come into effect regarding transitional into mitigating transitional stress for the dogs coming into the shelter. So it's important to note that it's one possible intervention that's available for shelter dogs, but it's possible that it's not always going to be the best tool available. It's situationally dependent and oftentimes needs a little bit of a warning. We shouldn't just give every dog coming into the shelter trazodone. We should look at the policies currently in place at those shelters and try a combination of different enrichment practices. But like I said, this is just one tool to consider. So if you're interested in this research in particular, I will go ahead and share the PowerPoint slides of this presentation at the end, and that will be in a PDF form, and then you can click this link to go to the free preprint of this. Unfortunately, the actual paper is behind a paywall, but we do have a preprint available that has the actual material and most of the language that's included. So the next tool I'd like to discuss is evaluating the effect of breed stereotypes, particularly the effect on length of stay in the shelter. Wow, too far. So I really love this slide. This is a slide that Nicole, the student and collaborator, created, and I think it's a really great one. She always says that you should imagine that you're working at an animal shelter and these 4 dogs come in and you are responsible for filling out the dog's kennel card to provide adopters with information about this dog. And so one of the things that you have to fill in is breed. So in thinking about this, do you know the breed of these dogs? And I really like that when Nicole asks this, her comment is always that we don't know the breed of these dogs. We only know that one of them is a bunny, which I think is pretty cute. So studies have shown that staff working at animal shelters also vary in their perception of different breeds. So breed labeling is generally not a process that's based on science or on the genetics behind the dog's DNA. It's actually a process that's generally based on intuition or prior experience and labeling based off of physical appearance. So as a result, how dogs are labeled tends to be relatively inconsistent and can vary drastically by shelter. These labels can end up very dramatically impacting a dog's time to adoption or their length of stay in the shelter. So dogs that are labeled things like pit bull or German shepherd often are associated with a label or a stigma of aggression or difficulty to manage. And those labels may make it more difficult for a possible adopter to consider having this dog. It's also important to note that in places like New York City, oftentimes landlords are very opposed to having these types of dogs in their properties. And so it can also be a barrier for entry in terms of renters in an area where renting is quite common. So what's interesting is that breed labels can affect length of stay. And this is from a great study by Lisa Gunter that looked at a shelter in Orange County in Florida. And only what they found was that when breed labels were used on the kennel cards, only 52% of pit bull type dogs were adopted. And when they removed the label, 64% of pit bull type dogs were adopted. So this is telling us that potentially this could be helpful for dogs that have these stigma associated with them. So what Nicole did was she worked with Byosiere as a limited intake animal shelter in New York City as well. And she worked with Byosiere in particular because they had previously used breed labels, and then in about 2018 had stopped using breed labels, partly because of Lisa Gunter's research, which is great. I think that's amazing. And so the data set that we ultimately looked at was comprised by these two groups that we termed breed labels used and breed labels not used. And as you can see, she's got about 1,000-ish dogs in both of the groups across two 16-month time periods. And what's interesting about Byosiere is that Byosiere has a really unique structure that gives us a super exciting opportunity to compare length of stay at a city adoption site. So that's listed here as letter A. They have a site that's in Manhattan, but they also have two other locations. Both are in the New York area. One is, well, they're both also on Long Island. They have the Wantagh location, which is B here on this graph, and that mainly serves as an intake facility. And then they also have the West Hampton location, which is denoted by the C. And this is home to Byosiere's second adoption center. So what's interesting is that we can compare the length of stay across this these kind of multi-site shelter locations while keeping the organizational structure of Byosiere itself the same. And so this can help us answer questions about whether or not removing breed labels generalizes to different types of shelter facilities. So this is just a breakdown of Nicole's data cleaning process and how she organized all of this. She had to spend a lot of time looking at who to include and who not to include. But the nice thing about Byosiere was that they were a limited intake animal shelter. So we were able to include most of the dogs in the shelter from these two 16-month time periods. And then we asked a couple of questions. The first question we asked was, is the removal of breed labels associated with a decreased length of stay in the shelter? And what Nicole found was actually yes. So across all locations, the average length of stay of a dog in the shelter without breed labels was 8.3 days shorter on average than a dog that had breed labels used. And she drilled this down as well by different locations, looking at Manhattan, West Hampton, and Wantagh. Manhattan and West Hampton both showed significant differences between the breed labels used and the breed labels not used categories in terms of length of stay. The only one that didn't was Wantagh. That's because, like I mentioned earlier, Wantagh is more of an intake facility, and so they don't have many adoptions here. So while they have, you can see that they have 38, an average length of stay of 38 days when breed labels were not used versus 26.7. Or sorry, 38 days when breed labels were used versus 26.7 when breed labels were not. This is still a difference. This sample size making up the Wantagh location is very small. Another thing that's actually not depicted here, but is also important to note, was that the rate of return, so dogs being brought back to the shelter, was constant during both of these two 16-month time periods. It was always 6%. So it suggests that by removing the breed labels from the kennel cards, you're not detracting any relevant information from the dog owner or the possible adopter that they might need that might ultimately end up in a return. The other fun thing that Nicole did is she performed a Cox regression to identify what other variables were also affecting length of stay. So it's interesting that we see that there's a difference in the length of stay between these two different time periods, but she wanted to also make sure what sort of phenotypic characteristic also affected length of stay in the shelter. And so what's interesting is that Nicole found that there was no effect of coat color, size of the dog, gender, age, type of adoption, and place of adoption. The only thing that we did find that was a significant covariate on length of stay in both time periods was the behavior assessment color that the shelter assigns the dog. So they rank their dogs in terms of different colors. So green being a dog that potentially could go to just any adopter, and red being the extreme end, potentially a dog that needs a little bit more attention and care. And so what we ended up finding was that dogs with a red behavior assessment color were the least likely to be adopted in both periods relative to all of the other colors as well. And this sort of makes a little bit of sense, I think. So Nicole had some recommendations regarding her research. The first is that there are further studies that are needed to examine these trends beyond the local level. It's really great that we've been able to sort of extend on the findings that Dr. Gunter found in Florida to transfer and see the generalizability to New York City shelters, and also the fact that Byosiere has this unique multi-location structure helps us really think about how these findings could generalize from a more urban environment to a more suburban environment. But future studies are definitely needed to examine these trends beyond just this New York City local level. And one of the things that we can sort of think about is whether or not shelter-specific databases can help organizations track the effects of these types of policy changes over time. In any organization, whether or not it's a shelter, corporation, etc., when a policy change is made, it's really important to measure the impact post-implementation. So it's really encouraging that we could see this and all these findings across the Byosiere locations. And so this might suggest that shelters that have not already removed breed labels from adoption cards could possibly consider it, depending on the other tools that they currently implement already on site. There's also limitations and cautions. The administrative or personnel factors could have had an impact on this study. This is an active operating shelter. We have no control over new incoming staff, and so it's possible that this could have had an effect on the results. The data is also, like I said, only specific to Byosiere as an animal shelter organization, so we don't know if they would extend to an organization like ACC. This is a limited intake animal shelter, and the findings may not generalize to an open admission animal shelter. That's something that we still need to look into and evaluate. The medical history of each dog may not have been complete. This could have had an effect on how long they stayed. And the behavior assessments and the determinations of coat color, size, etc., age, these were all taken at face value. We did not do any additional analyses on these to determine whether or not they were accurate. And so this is something that could have been biased by staff intuition, things like that. And so that could have certainly impacted the findings. If you're interested in Nicole's paper, we actually just published it. It came out last month, and it's freely available. It's open access. So like I said earlier, I'll share these slides, and then you can go ahead and click this link, and it will take you right to the paper. And the last thing that I'd like to just chat about today is an ongoing project that we're working on about minimizing in-kennel stress behaviors. This guy right here. And so this project is currently taking place at Animal Care Centers of New York. And in 2020, ACC began thinking about how to change the lighting in their kennel environment. And it's important to highlight that 93% of commercial spaces, including spaces like shelters, also universities, where I spend most of my time, use standard fluorescent lighting. And traditionally, ACC has used fluorescent lighting with lights off policies, and they're considering and have been considering switching to flicker-free LED lighting. The reason for this is that wavelengths and brightnesses of fluorescent lighting can affect mood and behavior in humans. That causes headaches, fatigue, visual stress. It can decrease dopamine levels and increase corticosteroid levels. It can cause stress, increase in repetitive behaviors. It can diminish play behaviors in animals. So these are not super fun side effects. And LED lighting, in comparison to fluorescent lighting, has been shown to improve the well-being of other domesticated animals like broiler chickens. So if you've ever spent too long in fluorescent lighting conditions and you've suffered a headache, this is possibly why. So our amazing student, Christina Wilson, is working on a project evaluating the effects of fluorescent lighting on in-kennel behavior. And she's working on this project at animal care centers. And I have these videos, but I actually think that I forgot to share my sound, so it may not work. So let me go ahead and share my computer sound really quickly so that you can hear this poor guy howling a little bit. That's just a reminder right now that if your headphones are up to high, maybe turn them down a little bit. Hopefully this won't be too loud. So you can hear this guy's having a little bit of a sad time. And then we've got this guy over here who's panting and lip licking, and his friend seems pretty relaxed in the background. And so that's just something to point out, that the shelter is not maybe stressful for every dog. So I think this guy over here is embodying what quarantine feels like. Apologies for the cameras. Sometimes they don't always hang straight, and they're at a very convenient butt level. I have no other better way of describing that. So they often have, they get knocked down a little bit by people backing up. And then here we've got Sam. This is Sam over here. I'll explain a little bit more about Sam later, but this is his time at the shelter. So this is just to demonstrate that you see a wide variety of different types of behaviors in the shelter. Some dogs play, some dogs hold something, some dogs lip lick, some dogs pant, some dogs pace. There's a whole variety of different things that happen. And so while we don't have data currently for this project, we're looking at whether or not fluorescent lighting impacts these stress behaviors, or just also the general activity patterns of these dogs in the kennels at ACC. And so we are taking short clips every hour on the hour from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. We started this in February and March, just as coronavirus started to hit. We paused for a little bit as we reevaluated what to do, and we started data collection again in July and August. And for our July and August data set, we are using this to answer our question of fluorescent lighting versus flicker-free LED lighting. But the interesting thing is that Christina started her project 2 weeks before the shutdowns in New York City. And so we have this great set of videos now from late February, early March, as well as July and August. And we hope to continue collecting footage to evaluate maybe what are the effects of COVID of these dogs in the shelter in terms of their behavior. So like I mentioned, we're thinking about getting these videos coded. We're working on them actively to evaluate whether or not lighting, particularly fluorescent lighting, has any effect on in-kennel stress behavior, and if we can provide alternatives. We're also looking at activity budgets of these dogs and possibly the effects of COVID. And as Christina always likes to mention, if you're feeling a little bit down after having watched these videos of the dogs in the kennels, they are now all out of the shelter. They are in homes. And this is a great example of one of them. Sam was in one of I think the last video we watched, and Christina couldn't help herself. She took him home at the start of quarantine when there was a big push in New York City to get the dogs into foster homes. And so this is Sam living out his best life in her home. And sadly, Sam recently just passed away because of an underlying autoimmune condition. But it's just to highlight that he had a great life in his last 6-7 months. And so many of these dogs are also doing the same. So all in all, we've made some really interesting observations in New York City about how to improve the lives of shelter dogs, or how we can attempt to. And we have now, I hope, established or helped further establish some of the research, which suggests that these methods that we are evaluating can be used as tools, like I said earlier, within this animal sheltering toolbox. But I would be remiss in saying that these are the only tools. I highlighted many at the start of the talk. These are just a couple more. And so it's of the utmost importance that when we're considering implementing these policies and adopting these practices, we consider the generalizability of these findings to different populations, to shelters in different settings, to shelters that already use various methods that have been presented. And so we also need to evaluate the outcomes of these policy changes. So it's important to note that these tools all work hand in hand, and that there is no one tool that fits all. And that's kind of my biggest caveat to all of this research. We are trying to do research in applied setting, and that means we have oftentimes limited control over the surroundings. And so even though we may be finding results that make sense for ACC or results that make sense for Byosiere, it's important to consider that multiple tools are likely in place, and it could be that a combination of these tools is really what's driving these results. It could also be that a tool that fits in one shelter does not fit in another, and so that's just worth keeping in mind before instilling policy changes. And with that, I would just like to thank everyone who has been extremely instrumental in helping us conduct this research. And if you have any questions, I will try my best to answer them, but also Jen, Nicole, and Christina are the powerhouses behind this research, and they can probably answer your questions a million times better than I can. So I may refer you to their email accounts if I don't have a good answer for you. We also need to thank our amazing Thinking Dog Center research team that's been coding many of the videos that we have for Christina's project. And these are high school students in the New York area. Actually, one of them is, and the rest are undergraduates and master's students at Hunter College. And we wouldn't be able to do this awesome work without them. And if you're interested in following us online, feel free to do so. We have a great lab manager who posts amazing footage and content of dogs at the Hunter TDC Twitter page. And if you'd like to follow me, my handle's down there too. But thank you for joining me, and it was lovely to get to chat about our studies, and I'd be happy to take any questions and chat more about the research we've been doing.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sarah. And just a reminder, everyone, if you have questions, please go ahead and type them in the chat box and we will get to them. And just to start us off, you do a really great job of describing what a typical shelter looks like and some of the challenges like strange noises, disrupted routines, the lighting, isolation. What is your vision for the ideal shelter? Or do we need to visualize a world without shelters? So either moving to foster homes or a new creative idea that maybe you've been thinking about?
I really like this question because, and I've mentioned her name so many times here, Lisa Gunter has done an amazing job in this field. And one of the things that she's mentioned, and I've heard her talk about, is how she went in once and was asked to sort of look at a more upscale, really lovely shelter that had these beautiful glass kennels. It was just impeccably phenomenal, except it really was not outfitted for an ideal shelter environment. And so one of the things that I sort of envision is thinking about how every space is completely different. The ACC location in Manhattan is actually in what used to be, what I believe is an old school. So it is not set up in any way, shape, or form to be a shelter. The kennels are lifted off the ground slightly. Many of the rooms don't have lighting. And so for us in particular, that's why we were interested in asking this lighting question of, how annoying might it be to be in this environment for 24 hours a day with some breaks here and there and some outdoor time. But I think it really depends on a whole bunch of factors that are specific to the area. So is it rural or is it urban? Because in New York City, we're hardly ever going to have the chance to build an entirely new space to accommodate this. We hardly have enough space for the people that live in the city. And so there's a couple of shelters out in Long Island that have recently updated their sort of shelter environment. And some of the things that they've done is sort of make optional rooms or additional rooms. So in instances where you do have space, having the option for some animals to potentially be collectively housed together. This also depends, right, on the animals. It depends on the time of year. It depends on how many there are. And so it could be that this works great sometimes, but not all the time. And for some animals, but not all the animals. I also like thinking about the possibility of having every animal in a foster home. I think this is a lovely idea. Whether or not this works in practice and whether or not this is something that is better is extremely difficult to answer, right? Because when COVID came around, ACC and many of the New York City animal shelters had no dogs. That's essentially the reason why we stopped video recording, was there were no dogs in the kennel. They were all out in foster homes, which I think is an amazing and massive effort on the community's part to get involved in helping these animals. And I think it's lovely because you can see a joint interaction that could be mutually beneficial for both the temporary guardian and the pet. However, it may not be possible for each and every organization to make sure that they are in a fantastic home, right? And so you lose a lot of control by having your animals off-site. So then it's about shifting resources potentially and thinking about how do you offer a policy or create and establish a policy to make sure that the animals are in fact being taken care of and are not being put into a situation where they're worse off than they could be at the shelter. So a lot of it is what is ideal and what is feasible. And I think there's so much variation that it really just does depend. But all this research that we're doing, even though it may just relate to one specific set of circumstances, is really important because it does highlight when things work and when things don't. And now we can move forward and start seeing how often are they working? Where are they working? And these things are really necessary in the applied world.
It's so complicated. Ocean asked, thank you for this great talk. I was wondering what behavioral assessments or tests you used for the color coding.
Yeah, so we didn't behaviorally assess the dogs or code their behavior. So these are codes that are used by the shelter organization themselves. The one that you're talking about is from Byosiere. So they have their own internal system and their own behavior assessment team. So we took the colors that they assigned the dogs at face value. And so that could certainly be a huge problem with the study. It may not be accurate, right? Who knows if the codes that were being assigned were actually representative of their behavior. One of the things that is interesting to note about their behavior codes is I believe they started out with green, orange, or green, yellow, sorry, and red. And sort of along the lines, we noticed in their data set that they adopted an in-between color of blue, which was not necessarily yellow, but not necessarily green. And so it was this combination. And so it was interesting to see that evolve, that they needed to create more behavior categories to kind of ascribe to the variation of all the dogs in the shelter. But that's certainly an area that needs additional research is, are these behavior assessments that are being used valid? And there's actually a recent paper on the use of behavior assessments because they often are critiqued quite heavily. And some people also argue that, you know, they may be the best that we have right now. And so we need to think about, is it worth cutting them or is it not worth cutting them? Or what is the solution? And it's, once again, a question that's easier asked than actually solved.
Yeah, great. Beer to ask, I like the idea of removing breed labels, and it appears to work, but people who adopt are likely to assign their own breed label. Have you looked into the effects of that?
No, but it would be super interesting. And that would be a really fun one to do. I'm laughing because my cousin just adopted a shelter dog, and they didn't know what he was. He's kind of this dachshund mixy thing, long boy. But they just did a genetic test for him at home, and it's telling them that he's part wolf of some sort. And it's like his saving grace. It's the thing that they're most proud of, is that he could be part wolf at some point. And so you're certainly 100% right in noticing that people love ascribing labels to their pets. And so if your dog is a is a shelter mixed breed with a poodle, you may start saying that that's a schnoodle or a golden doodle or whatever. And so I do think that there's a line of inquiry there that's really interesting and would be worth studying. If you ever want to talk projects, let me know, because I'd love to go down this road. I think we'd find out some interesting things.
So Sarah, it looks like there's no more questions in the chat box, but thank you so much for your time and for sharing your really cool research during a time when it's important and really, really interesting to think about all the things that happen when animals are in quarantine, since we've all lived through some sort of quarantine ourselves. So thank you for your time and thank you for your ideas.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for putting this all on and working so diligently and getting scientists to do this. I think it's an amazing thing you guys have created. There's like 700 people on your Slack site, which is phenomenal. So I look forward to catching up and seeing all the fun talks that are presented and seeing the upcoming ones as well. Thank you guys for joining. If you ever have any additional questions, please email and let me know. I'd be happy to chat more about any of these things.